Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Josephine Franklin, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Our topic today is telling only half the story, leveraging benchmarks and national post-secondary data to improve your student outcomes. Following are a few technical notes of information to assist you during the webinar. If you have a technical problem during the broadcast, please call Zoom support at the toll-free number typed in red, 888-799-9666, extension 2, and provide today's webinar ID that you see typed in red, 784-513-512. As you participate in this webinar, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NASSP webinar. We are also on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available as well as the PowerPoint on NASSP's website within 24 hours at NASSP/webinar. We are pleased to have with us today John Schiappa. John Schiappa joined the National Student Clearinghouse as a product manager in 2017. A former math and science special education teacher, John has worked in and around education for about 10 years, including performance analytics, program evaluation and improvement, and school management. His private sector experience is in business process improvement, sales, and information technology.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that introduction. As Joe said, my name is John Schiappa. I'm with the National Student Clearinghouse, and I want to thank you for joining us today. NASSP was kind enough to offer me a spot to talk about some of the great things that the National Student Clearinghouse is producing, particularly some of the products that I serve focused on post-secondary outcomes. So what I wanted to talk to you today is how to use the data that we provide through some of our post-secondary products with the national benchmark reports produced by the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, and how to highlight your student pathways and improve your college and career readiness programs. So let me start by talking a little bit about the National Student Clearinghouse. So the Clearinghouse was formed in 1993. If anybody is familiar with the student loan crisis of the late 80s, early 90s, the challenge at the time was that students were transferring, graduating, moving on to post-bachelor's education, and unfortunately no one was telling the organizations that were funding their loans or tracking their loans, and so the deferment rate was up around 24%. The National Association of College Registrars, the student loan finance industry, as well as colleges and universities and the Department of Education got together and said, we need to solve this problem. How they decided to do that was to create a clearinghouse where all of the colleges and universities would submit their enrollment data to, and then that organization would be responsible for submitting data to the Department of Education, the loan servicers, and any other organizations of need at the time. Obviously, that organization is the National Student Loan Clearinghouse. In around 2001, we changed our name to the National Student Clearinghouse. So that puts us in a pretty unique position. At this time, in 2019, it means that we collect, on average, about 98% of Title IV degree granting institution enrollment and degree data. It puts us in a place where we have better coverage than the national census does related to post-secondary outcomes. recently, within the last 10 years, we've also made inroads into working with K through 12 programs. And so we partner with over 12,000 high schools, and that roughly represents about 55% of US 12th graders. At this point in time, we're also working with 38 state agencies, or about 85% of the national state level education organizations. To put that into perspective, that means that we roughly work in or around 25 million enrollment records a month. That equates to about 1.3 billion transactions every year. And we are actually, I'm happy to say, about 3,800 plus participating colleges and universities. So there's a very good chance that if you have a post-secondary degree in the United States, we have the enrollment and the degree information associated with your degree. I wanted to talk about StudentTracker for high school specifically, because StudentTracker for high schools leverages all of that great, robust data that we get at the post-secondary side to help state agencies, districts, high schools, intermediate agencies track student graduates after they've left their high schools. Most of the time, districts have a great understanding of where their students are from pre-K all the way through 12th grade, but once they leave their doors, each student becomes a little black hole of information, and you're not quite sure, are they working? Are they in college? Are they living at home? Have they gone out of state? We can provide an insight into that. We have the capacity to look at each individual student that is submitted to us and determine whether or not they are currently enrolled in college, have been enrolled in college, whether or not that college is a 2-year or 4-year institution, whether it's in-state or out-of-state, whether it's public or private. So we cross state lines. We have a national perspective. And that really puts the data that we give you into a high value category, because it means that you're no longer having to scrape through social media, email students, text them, call grandparents, call parents and say, where is John? Now you know where John is. You know that John is enrolled. And it really helps you understand those paths your students take to post-secondary success, whether that be an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or a post-bachelor's degree, graduate degree, or a doctoral program. So the big benefit of StudentTracker for high schools is the ability to drive programmatic improvement. And what do I mean by that? Well, from us through StudentTracker for high schools, you'll get detailed student level enrollment information. So you'll get John Smith's enrollment history, degree history, transfer history, and whether or not they started at a community college and transferred to a 4-year school, or the reverse, or got a degree in 4 years and moved on to a master's program, what have you. Even if they stepped out, came back, and ultimately earned a degree within 8 years, we'll be able to provide that information to you. We also give you easily accessible full color reports that look at trends longitudinally over 8 years. Those reports follow a bunch of different segments. So we look at the fall right after high school graduation. We look at second semester of freshman year enrollment. We look at enrollment within 2 years, 6-year adjusted cohort, 8-year cohort outcomes. And we also do that for all of the segments that I noted before, whether or not it's an in-state institution, an out-of-state institution, a public or private, a 2-year or a 4-year. And if you give us optional data elements that include academics and demographics, we will also segment that data. So you'll have a really great aggregate summary of how your students of color performed against the rest of your student body, how your boys compare to your girls, how your Title I compares to the rest of your student body, same for special education, English language learner, so on and so forth. And now that you understand a little bit about the StudentTracker for High School's product, the one thing I want to touch on is the National High School Benchmark Reports. These are a really unsung value to the education community. They're often cited in press releases for about 2 weeks after they're released, but they're not, in my estimation, used very much outside of that. And I think that's a shame because there's a lot of great insight provided in this. First off, the benchmark reports are produced by the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, which is an independent arm of the National Student Clearinghouse. They're released annually every October, and it reports on 2 years of high school classes with a snapshot inclusion up to 6 years. So there is a 6-year cohort output. And it looks at the class preceding the most recent class. So at this point in time, right now we're about to get the first fall enrollments for the class of 2019. So the high school benchmark report that was just released looks at the class of 2018, 2017, and 2012. And it looks at a bunch of different data that's not necessarily available within StudentTracker for high school. So as I said before, you can track first fall enrollment, first year enrollment, enrollment within 2 years, but we also pull in data that's available through National Center for Education Statistics Common Core of data. And that data looks at whether or not a institution is considered high income or low poverty, low income or high poverty, high or low minority, and the urbanicity of the institution. And one thing I will say here, just as a clarification, you can look at these definitions on any of the high school benchmark report. It's publicly available. In fact, I believe I've got a link in the in the presentation at the bottom. But one thing I want to call out is the difference between high income and low poverty, or low income and high poverty. The way that the clearinghouse calculates those values is that if a school has less than 25% of its population on free and reduced lunch as reported to National Center for Education Statistics, then that's considered a low poverty, high income, low poverty school. If it's greater than 25%, that's just considered a high income school. If the FRL number is greater than 75%, then it's considered a high poverty, low income school. So high and low income are essentially the top and bottom quartiles. The low poverty and high poverty are essentially the middle two quartiles, is a good way to look at it. And then high or low minority is an indication of students of color, whether or not African American or Latinx students make up greater than 40% of the population combined at a school. That's considered a high minority school. Urbanicity looks at the census designation codes for urban-centric locale. That's a really technical term for the census determining whether or not schools or districts reside in rural, suburban, or urban areas. And the codes that are accounted for in this report you can find in the definitions. I won't go through those. So when you're looking at the StudentTracker for high schools data compared to the National Center for Education Statistics data, it's really important to note that these are two different disparate data sets that we put together to create a greater whole. And so you'll be able to take your StudentTracker for high schools outcomes, looking at the first fall enrollment, the first year, and the first 2 years, and be able to directly compare them to the benchmarks, first fall, first year, and enrollments. But if you want to get to the next step down, which is looking at poverty, minority, and urbanicity, you need to look up your institution and the National Center for Education Statistics, which is actually pretty easy. They have a great tool where you can log into the website, select a district finder or school finder, type in your name, your school's name, your address, zip code, so on and so forth, and you'll be given your institution's profile pretty quickly, and you can export that into any tool you want: PDF, Excel, CSV, other text, so on and so forth. And I will say that you know, this is a manual effort right now, but we are actually releasing a report later this year, later this academic year, that combines the data together. So we will actually give you, as a subscriber, an individual look at the high school benchmark reports. So you'll actually see how your organization is classified and how you compare to the national benchmarks for institutions that look like you. So it's much more of a direct one-to-one comparison. But unfortunately, that hasn't been released yet. We're looking to do that around April of 2020. And so why is it really important to track against these two things? And I think one of the things that we lose sight of in an age of accountability through data is every single data point that we pull represents a student pathway. And each pathway can be one that is either known to us, assumed by us, or hidden to us. And I think it's very important as education leaders to step up and really map out those pathways for each individual student, because I can pretty much guarantee you that for every student who's struggling, there is a student who succeeded in similar situations. And being able to leverage the lessons learned or the successes that have been had by that student who succeeded in order to support the student who may be struggling will make that much more easier in the long run for that struggling student. And so when we're looking at the benchmark reports versus the high school reports, you can do direct comparisons. If you know that you are a low income, high poverty, low income school, a low minority school, a rural school in the case highlighted here, you can see pretty clearly that this institution is performing pretty well against institutions that may look like them. And in fact, looking at that enrollment rate, they're doing pretty well compared to across the board nationally. And if you look at the same institution in terms of persistence, students who've enrolled their freshman year and continue to enroll their sophomore year, this institution is also, for the most part, outperforming organizations that look like them. 79% for low-income schools, 88% for low minority schools, and 84% for rural schools. So when we get to the question, the Q&A part of this webinar, one of the things that I would like to ask everybody participating is, what are your thoughts on being able to pull insight out of this data? Now remember, we're looking at aggregate data right here, but we do give you what we call unit record line item data. So you will get to see who all of those students are that makes up the 87% who have continued from freshman to sophomore year. You'll be able to look at the individual students in a high school graduating class and see what their enrollment trends are. You'll be able to combine that with the rest of your data. So your chronic absenteeism data, your college and career readiness interventions, your social emotional learning skills pathways, your career and technical education or your dual enrollment coursework, and be able to say, okay, how did my students of color enrolled in a CTE program fare against the rest of my student population as it relates to first fall enrollment or enrollment immediately after high school graduation? How did my student athletes fare in persistence and retention across 6 or 8 years compared to the rest of my student population? What programs were the students who graduated within 4 years a part of when they were enrolled in my high school? All of this is autopsy by data, I understand that, but at the end of the day, if you can find a hidden pathway that you didn't know before, that hidden pathway has the potential to help any number of students following in those footsteps. So again, I kind of jumped ahead, but the question that I always sort of ask at this point in time is, so what, now what, right? So you're looking at post-secondary outcomes. Now what do I do for it? And the answer that I always try to give is that at one point in time, we felt that the typical high school graduating student graduated high school, probably worked a job over the summer, or went to beach week, or did something typically high schoolish or typically milestone-y, and then enrolled in college, and then 4 years later they walk out their gabled hallways with a degree in hand, and ready to charge into the workforce. And I think we all know that that's a bit of a myth. The average student at this point in time has 3 transfers and takes 6 years to get from first college enrollment to post-secondary degree. And that includes both associates and bachelor's degrees. And so how do we map that back to the programs that we have in place at our high schools and even our middle schools or earlier to say, what are the things that predict success? What are the interventions that enabled students to avoid the pitfalls of remedial coursework or multiple transfers or step outs? And there's been great work done at the post-secondary level to help address some of that, but I think we're starting to see the groundswell of information available at the secondary level to be able to support that. And that really is the key to what StudentTracker for high schools and what the high school benchmark reports can help support. Another facet of this is one of the things I always like to ask at conferences or when I meet people in situations like this is, do you ever feel boxed in by your state report cards or your district report cards or your accountability metrics? And oftentimes the answer is absolutely. I feel like somebody else owns that and I don't. And one of the great things about this information is because this is national coverage, because this is the same data that the state agencies and the districts are using to calculate their post-secondary attainment rates. You have the capacity as a high school leader to take that same data and look at it in reference to your other data sets and craft a narrative that supports the success you've seen in your schools. One of the things I constantly hear from principals is all I want to do is take back my narrative. I want to make sure that my school leaders, my community leaders, my teachers, and my parents and students know that there is success to be had here, and here's where we've acknowledged our challenges and here where we've seen our success. It also, at the end of the day, allows for programmatic improvement. If you can't measure it, it can't be changed. And if you can measure it, you learn valuable insights and you can change based on that. So I always say, StudentTracker might be autopsy by data, but it is validated success. And so you can take those validated nuggets of success and map them back to where those students were in points in time to help other students navigate to the same successful outcome. So I'm going to take time for questions and answers. I'm pretty sure that there's probably a lot at this point in time.
Thank you, John. Yes, we do have a question here for you. What pathways do your students take to post-secondary success?
So that's a great question, and I think that that really goes back to each individual high school or district and what they've decided matters to them most. I've worked with a number of high schools where their primary measures, I really just, I want to get my graduation rate up and I want to get my first fall enrollment up. So what are the 2 things that we're going to do to help drive up high school graduation and drive up post-secondary enrollment? And a lot of times what that boils down to is the little things, and quote unquote little things. It's FAFSA completions. It's making sure that students are taking remedial courses in high school as opposed to over the summer or in college. Making sure that there are systems in place to identify whether or not those students need remediation earlier than later. It's partnering with local community colleges to do dual enrollment. It's those types of situations. I had just to give a brief anecdote, I had a principal stopped me at a conference last year, and he said, just for fun, I took my my StudentTracker data and I paired it up against my teacher evaluation data, and he goes, you have to be careful what audience you say that to, because some people might be a little cautious about that. But he said, I really didn't look at it from a perspective of trying to tease out people who weren't performing or teachers who weren't sort of making the grade. But he said, I wanted to see if something popped. And one of the things that popped for him was a teacher who he felt needed more coaching in instructional skills, classroom management, who wasn't necessarily disliked by her students, but also wasn't necessarily liked by her students. Was looking at this going, okay, well, how can I make this sort of mediocre teacher an excellent teacher? And what he found is that teacher had a 30% higher post-secondary enrollment rate, not only in her department, but across the school. And so all of a sudden that flipped the conversation in his mind from, okay, instead of making her attend PLCs, maybe I should have her lead PLCs, because there's obviously something happening in her classroom that is driving expectations for these students that aren't being delivered elsewhere. And so really, being able to tease out the data in such a way that you find little moments of truth like that to be able to affect those daily interactions and be able to affect the things that students interact with on a day-to-day basis, I think is the best way to leverage the availability of this data.
Okay. Here's another question for you, John. You know the visible ones, meaning the visible pathways, but do you know the invisible ones?
Yeah, that's also a great question. That's also a tough question to answer because, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, I think we as school leaders, we go into our offices or our classrooms, and we have a picture in our head of those students we think are successful, of those students who we think, okay, I don't need to worry about that student right now because I've got, I know that they're going to do their homework. I know that they're going to go ahead and complete their assignments. I know that they're probably going to do well on this test, or they're not going to be a behavior issue. So I'm going to focus on those kids that I do think are going to have academic challenges or behavioral challenges. And I certainly saw it in my classroom day in and day in about myself, about me making assumptions. And one of the things that data really illuminates is that if it's clean and it's good data, it's objective data. And objective data gives you the ability to shine a flashlight in some of those dark corners that may be collecting a little bit of dust and you really haven't paid attention to in a while. And highlight where you might have both sides of a coin, where you might have hidden success or hidden challenges. And so I really stress that while StudentTracker is a great piece of data, and I wouldn't be up here promoting it if I didn't think it was a fantastic tool with a high value. It's not the only thing out there. There are a wealth of other data sets to utilize, from attendance data to grade data to academic or test scores to absenteeism to whatever, that can be used in conjunction with other data sets like StudentTracker to really highlight where you might have pockets of success you didn't think you had, and really tease out, why is this a successful pocket? What about these students or their programs are so successful, and how can I replicate that in other areas?
Thank you. John, I'm not seeing any other questions on my end. Perhaps you do it on your end?
Yeah, I think I've got a great 2 questions from Jennifer, so I'll just go ahead and read them real quick. I can see great possibilities with having individual student level data to track outcomes. A challenge is merging those data after the fact. And then how do you advise high schools considering students who make a gap year? So that's a great, okay, so I'm going to take those one at a time, right? Data as a tool is, I think, always a bit of a challenge. At the end of the day, StudentTracker for high schools was designed by researchers for researchers, used primarily by guidance counselors. And that to me means that we at the Clearinghouse have a good way to go to making the data accessible and usable and intuitive the first time you log in, every time you log in. And to that end, we actually just submitted a grant to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to do some reworking of our StudentTracker platform to build a much better UI and deliver a reporting structure that is much more intuitive. And that grant was awarded actually 2 days ago. So don't tell anybody. I don't think that's actually been released publicly yet. So I might get in trouble. We're not recording this, right? I'm kidding. So we're actually going to be doing some significant work here in the next few months to make the data that we have much more easy to use. And then when you talk about advising high schools to consider students take a gap year, that I think that all boils down to each individual student. I look back on my academic career. I was one of those hidden typical kids. I graduated high school, went right into college, spent 2 years at a private institution, decided this was not for me, took a stop out year, worked full time, went back because I realized that working full time without a college degree was not for me either. Went to community college and then transferred to a 4-year degree. So it took me 8 years to get through college working full time. But I think to my high school guidance counselor, I was probably one of those kids that was like, okay, 4 and done, we're good to go. And that wasn't the case. And so I think that all boils down to, being able to tease out those students who did successfully take gap years and looking at the programs and the situations that they were in to be able to advise future students of what they can be able to do. And then, Jennifer, thank you for this question. So you've hit on the hidden challenge when it comes to post-secondary outcomes. I call it the 3 E's, right? We've got enlistment, we have enrollment, and we have employment. Right now, National Student Clearinghouse can do enrollment very, very well. We are working with both the Department of Defense and with major credentialing organizations to be able to provide data around enlistment and employment. We are also working with technical colleges to ensure that we can report on non-credit bearing certificate courses. So those courses associated with like a medical, like a phlebotomist certificate or a cosmetology certificate or something that wouldn't necessarily carry academic credit, but is considered an industry credential. I will say right now within StudentTracker, if a student is awarded a certificate that does carry academic weight, those certificates are reported out. So you'll actually be able to see this student earned a certificate as a Microsoft certified systems engineer or a certified networking engineer or something like that. And then, Melissa, our report is regularly missing student-level data for some students. Why would that be? They're included in the general report in terms of the total numbers. Is that a privacy issue? Yeah, you've actually hit it directly on the head. So one of the challenges that we all have to operate under is this 1974 law called the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, which really didn't contemplate a digital world. And one of the provisions of that is students and families of students, if they're underage, have the ability to essentially opt out of data reporting under FERPA. And we have some post-secondary institutions that completely, as a blanket block, say, okay, any student who enrolls here will not be reported out. And then we have certain institutions where when the student is given the questionnaire saying, do you want your data to be shared at enrollment? The default answer is no, and a lot of students don't change that because they just don't know the implications in terms of what the benefit is to the total education industry, or they do know that and they don't care. But the way that we can help get around that is the aggregate reports do include students who might have a FERPA block in place, as long as that student can't be identified by teasing out the data. So usually what that means is if we've got a pool of 15 or more students, we will go ahead and report out including FERPA blocked students because no single student could be identified.
Thank you, John. I've used up our time together here. So can I ask you to please advance onto the next slide? There you go. I'd like to extend an invitation to join your colleagues for the 2020 National Principals Conference, sponsored by NASSP, July 7th through the 9th, 2020 in National Harbor, Maryland. You can learn more about the conference and register at www.principalsconference.org. Thank you all for joining us today. That concludes our webinar.